Bam Pow Comic Hour with your hosts, Andrew Glonner
and Chris Ramos.
Tonight, we review and cover the legend, the one, the only, the myth,
The Red
Hellboy by Mike Mignola.
Yes.
And we have been waiting to do this episode for quite a while, I would say.
Yes.
We've been kicking
Months
it
and
around
months
for a
and months and
while.
months.
But with Hellboy, it has had several movies and several adaptations, but the origin story has been covered. It's been covered a lot, and we were always trying to figure out what's the best place to start. Where do you get people? What are some other stories you can recommend?
Like, is Hellboy a household name? Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Right.
I think the movie was popular enough to help push that narrative out there so people might search it.
Yes.
But I also think people don't realize just how long Hellboy's been around.
Absolutely. So, speaking of that, Hellboy has been around since 1994 when I was one.
That's a long time.
So,
It's a long time. I was in high school, but I do remember,
Absolutely.
I think I found Hellboy maybe around 97 or 98, something
Okay.
like that. Yeah.
absolutely. And so it was, I think I discovered it when the first movie came out with Ron Perlman and Guillermo del Toro directed it. And I've never seen a Guillermo del Toro movie, and that was kind of where he got his name out before he did like Pan's Labyrinth and things like that.
Well, yeah, and people saw him, I think, at that time when that movie came out was sort of the beginning of what people were considering comic book movies.
Absolutely.
So it
for
was
sure.
still early on, and
Yeah.
I really, really do think that Guillermo del Toro movie was uh, accurate to the comic book.
Yeah.
And it kept the tone not comical, because it could have went like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ish, because it's a very awkward character, and when you put
Yeah.
all this makeup on, and um, I think they
Yeah,
were
had the
riding a
right
fine
tone.
line of
Yeah.
like, how can we make this not
Sure.
what League of Extraordinary Gentlemen,
Oh,
like
yeah.
how can we make this still a serious movie? I think they did a
Yeah.
great job.
And I mean, around that time, like Spider-Man was coming out, Fantastic Four
Yeah,
had
that's
their
true.
second run of it. So
Blade maybe was out.
Blade,
Yeah,
yep.
yeah.
So those movies were doing their best attempt at a comic book adaptation without trying to capture those feelings and what do we want to get across in there? Like, okay, we have like a couple hour and a half, 2 hours maybe. How do we sell this character?
Right.
And stuff like that. So, and especially for Hellboy, like Hellboy, and he published it for like through Dark Horse, and he had some other early people picking up on the story. It's kind of a hard sell, I think, at first, but the movie just helped you, like, oh, what's this character? I've never heard of him. Oh, he's battling Nazis.
Yeah.
He's got this weird like
He's
mythology to him.
He's like a demon himself, which was cool. So he's sort of
Right.
like a humanoid demon, and the characters that they put together at kind of, I think, spoke to a lot of people because they're used to seeing teams.
Yes.
So they're like, oh, this is like the FBI or like Men in Black or like, BPRD or something.
Yeah.
So they're like, okay, cool. There's 3 or 4 main characters, and they all have special abilities
Yep.
or mutations or something.
Unique
that makes them-
personalities and things
Yeah.
like that. And so it was easy to fall in love with those characters and understand like the humor and the personality of Hellboy himself.
Yeah.
And which was really great to see that on screen by Ron Perlman. And we were talking about in the pre-show. I identify Hellboy with Ron Perlman because that was like some of the first memories of that character. Same with like Kevin Conroy for Batman. When I seen Kevin Conroy as Batman in the animated series, that's just the voice that's in my head.
Yeah.
Now.
And, fair enough. I mean, I think everyone has their own favorite superhero that, plays the part.
Sure. Maybe for you, it's like Adam West with Batman.
I'm not that old.
Not that old.
Maybe Michael Keaton. Batman.
Michael Keaton. Oh yeah, that's right. You felt because you were 89.
That opened up a lot for Batman.
But
in
some people
general.
do. So it's all about where you get exposed to these larger than life characters. That you can kind of see that in your mind and things like that.
Well, and if you look at the creators, so we look at Mike Mignola. He has had a long history of just comic book and art in general. So he's worked on Marvel Comics. He's worked on DC Comics. He's worked I think a lot of little indie projects and things.
Yeah, he had quite a
Yeah,
early span in, Marvel Comics
yeah,
and things
like
like that.
the 80s. I think is really strong 80s,
Yeah,
90s.
and he
So
had a Cosmic Odyssey and, like, or
yeah,
something like
I
that
think
in
90s was when
DC.
he maybe figured out that,
He wanted
okay, I did it. I did the Marvel thing,
yeah,
and now I'm
Marvel
going into
DC.
my own characters. And
Yeah,
sometimes that happens with creators where of course they can't help, if you are just constantly coming up with ideas, they just can't help to say, "Hey, wait, this is my guy. I'm not going to introduce him into the Marvel universe. This is like my guy."
yeah,
And so he may have pulled him back and just started, figuring out what is this story and how can I tell it. And I'm a super fan of Hellboy. I'm a super fan of Guillermo del Toro. I think
yeah.
that he was a great choice for the first Hellboy movie.
Mhm.
And I'm really glad that Hellboy still keeps that like indie feeling a little bit.
Yes,
He does,
absolutely.
it's not like crazy mainstream,
Mm-mm.
and they didn't make him all like trademark and make t-shirts and crazy. Like I
Yeah,
think he sort of has that indie feel, which is awesome
and I
to
think
me.
for anybody who wants to jump into this, if you like fictional history with like a side of horror
Yeah,
and it's
that's
like
true.
a tongue-in-cheek humor, you will love Hellboy.
Yes, that's I mean that's a given. Hellboy has been like an anti-hero, and then he's
Mhm.
been sort of a um I want to say he's like a gateway into mythology. So
Mhm.
Mike Mignola picks up on all of the old fables and
Yeah.
old wives' tales, and like pagan religions and like Nazis,
Yeah.
and I don't know. He blends them all together so that you know a, a good point, not to get too far off topic, but a fun thing to do is look up some of these characters and look up some of these stories that
Mhm.
he's writing about,
Yeah.
and they're real fables from hundreds of years ago. And it's just fun to see when Hellboy runs up against a monster or a group of people. And, uh, one of the main characters in the beginning is Rasputin and things like that. So
Yes.
you're like, you know what? These are roughly based on the dramatic tales of those characters.
Mhm.
So yes, Rasputin was a real person, but this is based more on like his fanatical
Yeah.
wizard side, right? Like
Exactly. And you always see like in movie adaptation stuff like the Nazis were experimenting with supernatural powers and
yes.
things like that. So he kind of took that concept and went, well, I can kind of insert my own character or kind of build it off that, but then give him like a redeeming like hero story out of that and a anti-hero kind of personality, but he cares, but he doesn't care enough at the same time. So he definitely it took a little bit for him to figure out how to um, move the story along and find a voice for the character. But like that origin story is so iconic.
Yeah.
Especially when you see it adapted, you're like, this is really cool. I've never seen anything like this before. Um, let's see what this is about.
Yeah, so we read, just so everyone knows, we read the library editions
Yes.
by Dark Horse Comics, and
Yep.
these are oversized. They are stitched binding. They're
Yep.
cloth covers. They're
Right.
full color, top to bottom. I mean, there's beautiful
Yes.
editions. Beautiful.
And so you can also read them. They have these omnibus, like trade paperback standard size editions. And I started reading those, and this is just my experience, and it might differ from yours, but it was hard to read the font of Hellboy, like some of the lettering and stuff like that, and
In,
kind of get
in the
into
paperbacks.
yeah.
Oh, hmm.
And I guess that was for me because I've read these. I read these at like the library in the oversized, and I was like, oh, this is okay. The story is very fast paced, so I was like, oh, I'll go read in the smaller size.
Yeah. There's not much text. I mean, there's text, but there's not like
Yeah,
a ton of text all
and
over.
I did eventually, and this is kind of how we got Kickstarter moved along and made the decision to read these because I eventually did get a set of the library editions, and I love them. They're so cool, and it's hard for me to go back to that smaller size. So I guess my point that I'm trying to get across is some books and some tales that we talk about and discuss. Some of them are you just kind of have to find your best reading experience to it.
Yeah, I mean, some people really like to read digital and get an idea of what the story is like.
Yeah.
And digital is fine. I read digital, but a lot of times I read it either because it's like crazy out of print and I can't find it anywhere, or it's like exactly that. I want to like see what it's like. I
Absolutely.
use
Definitely try it
digital.
out.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
use digital as like a movie trailer.
Mhm.
Like I read maybe one or two issues and I'm like, okay, this is good enough
Yeah.
for me to now
That
search it
was
out.
good for the omnibus editions. I think it was good for
Yes.
me to see what the story's about, get into it, and then there was just a certain point where like I want to read more, but I want a better reading experience, and that's where I invested in these editions. But they're all still like very affordable. I think you can get like almost each one for like around $30,
Hmm.
$30 to $40 a piece, which for what you're getting for your money's worth is actually pretty reasonable. And even today, you can still they keep these like almost evergreen, so
Yeah.
they keep them in print.
Yeah, these are
And
great, and they're affordable. They're great volumes. They look amazing on the shelf. They're definitely the print quality is top notch. I
yeah,
can't even rereading these because I read all these maybe like 2 years ago, and then kind of
sure,
rereading through them.
yeah,
It still holds up. Just oh, these are just great volumes, and I'm a super, super fan of Mike Mignola's work in
yes,
Hellboy. I've seen a lot of his older work. I've
yep,
seen a lot of his work that he's doing
yeah,
now. He's still very active. He's doing lots of different layouts and things.
hmm,
Um, what I really like about Hellboy, and I guess since we're jumping into
yep,
it, the library editions, they take a collection of the stories. So Hellboy has a lot of stories, and Mike Mignola is really good at like kind of setting them up as a chronology. So
yes,
he's always built this as like a giant long story that does have an end. He eventually wanted to,
yeah,
kind of tie it up into a bow.
yeah,
So it wasn't just like this forever character. So it's really great because he pulls old characters into the new stories, and he mentions like mythological characters that he brings up 2 volumes later. And it's
yeah,
you can tell he's got like a vision,
sure,
and he can keep rolling these characters around, and there's
yeah.
there's no shortage of um
Because it
fables
kind
and
of
things.
wraps, looking up on the internet, it kind of wraps around 2016, 2012. It kind of depends, like if you define the end as the end of the main story or the short story,
Yeah,
short
and then
stories
there are
and
a
things
lot
like
of
that.
little offshoots, of course. Little
Yes.
characters got their own stories here and there,
Yeah.
but the first library edition actually collects the first 2 stories, which is Seed of
The
Destruction
destruction.
and Wake
Wake
the
the devil.
Devil. And
Yeah.
so there's pretty much in that there's 2 main stories in that volume, but each one has like chapters in it. So
Yes.
it's really well done in that aspect that you can read through and feel like you're not like I guess what I'm trying to say is in some regular comics, you'll read through a story and you'll be like, I feel like I'm missing something. Like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, that picked up over in this other comic, or oh, that's running in Supergirl, and I don't collect
Oh,
Supergirl, and
absolutely. Yeah. It's
oh,
very self
Spider-Man.
contained in that
Yeah.
aspect.
So this one, Hellboy is Hellboy. There's no other story, and it's really I think a really enjoyable reading experience because you don't feel like there's any story that you should have known and you don't.
Sure. And it's kind of cool looking on the doing some research that in 1995 he won the best writer artist Eisner Award for this. So it's really cool
Yes.
to acknowledge that. And like, yeah, he did have some help in the beginning, but once he got rolling and kind of established his writing style with his art style, he really this character kind of really fleshed out on the page.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
And you can see that through the volumes. You actually see the artwork getting better. You see the story getting better. You see him n- um, being more adventurous and not afraid to have 2 or 3 pages with no text at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you see him using full pages, full splash pages, which, you know, early on when you're kind of introducing a new character, you try to sort of throw everything on the table that you got
Mhm.
because you don't want people to say, "Well, I just bought this comic and 8 of the pages were just full page art and
Oh,
no
sure.
text,
Yeah.
So he progresses the story, I think, at a good pace where you're not like, um, where you still want more, but you're not feeling like it was like, well, that didn't get me anywhere. Like it moves along. It's
Oh,
pretty nice.
absolutely. And I think he kind of learned the lessons of his predecessors, and he was trying to do something different at the same time where he wanted that great character that people could follow along and relate to, but he didn't want to have it bogged down.
Hmm.
But and he also has the mindset of an artist where he wants the page and the art to speak for itself as well.
Yes, the art.
So, being a fan of his work, Ramos, how would you describe his art to our audience?
So, hmm, I I would I would think a lot of people would read this. Let's just assume that you have read very text heavy comics, like major superhero comics, right?
Yeah.
And then you decide, well, I'm going to go into Hellboy. Some people might, I think, sort of offhandedly say it's minimalist,
Yeah.
and it is. It
Mhm.
is. I'll give you that. There's not a lot of like gradations, and there's not a lot of like Photoshopy,
Yeah.
lens flare, and
Mhm.
all that kind of um, uh, digital fluff. It's very much like two or three colors on a page.
Yeah.
Um,
That makes sense.
Lots of jet black
Yeah.
everywhere. I mean,
Right.
it's just like that's why I like the library volumes, because the library editions, however they printed them, they are black. The black is
Yeah.
black. I mean, it's one of the best printed volumes that you'll ever see. No joke. The
Yeah.
colors leap off of the pages. Um, but the nice thing about it is that I think Mike draws in a way where um, he kind of wants you to fill in the scene in your brain,
Yes. And
right?
we're a big advocate of that on the
Yes.
show here. To
Yes.
talk about the what happens between the panels, using your imagination and filling what's that story trying to get across, and how did they get to point A to point B within the paneling and the pacing.
And did you notice a lot of people, like, even though there's tons of words around, no one's really opening their mouth?
No.
That it's just sort of like these
Yeah.
static scenes,
Hmm.
which I really do like. A lot of time, sometimes people are like screaming because they have to scream, right? But, uh,
when
but
one does.
yeah, but like the scenes themselves are almost like photos. They're like still shots of what you
Yeah.
would imagine that scene if you just sort of randomly took pictures while something was happening.
Hmm.
This would be your photo album, and
Yeah.
not everyone is even opening their mouth with the text, but the the every single page, every single panel, I get this feeling that it's like really, really thought out. And that's what I just love is, I mean, honestly, you can randomly flip to just about any page in here and there's
Yep.
a purpose to it. There's a layout, there's a design, there's a color scheme.
Right. There's a
Y-
story. There's a point to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like some pages are all oranges and reds, and some pages are blues and grays, and some pages are, I mean, I'm just literally
Yeah.
flipping through the library volume
And
now.
definitely, though, that
Uh,
color palette kind of invokes a feeling too, and the mood
yeah, yeah, and
that you're trying to go for.
there's one page where like Hellboy was um leaping across to fight one of the monsters that came up one out of the frogs, the frog, I love that. Like they pick a
Yeah.
frog and they're like, no, not the frogs, and it's like a frog monster.
Yeah.
But he's like leaping across the page and it's all pretty subdued colors, and then Hellboy makes a comment like, well, now I'm mad, and then the whole background turns red.
Red.
So it was like, oh man, I mean, it's just he uses color to his
Yeah.
total advantage. And I could talk about his artwork for another hour. I mean, no joke. No joke. It's
For
just
sure.
amazing. It's great.
Yeah. And looking at some of these early volumes that he worked on himself, because he wrote and drew the book.
Hmm.
Um, that you see like some Kirby dots here and there, and you see some other like little influences here and there, but it took him a while for him to develop the style. Like on an earlier episode of the podcast, we talked about his um, he worked on Doctor Doom Triumph and Torment,
Yes.
and he worked with a different penciler, a different colorist and things like that. He did like the initial penciling and things like that, but just what he can do with his own vision and his own storytelling and things like that, and owning his work. Very much something he's developed a long time, and it pays off for him.
Yeah, and that's the other really nice thing about the library editions, and really any of these larger collected editions like Omnibus and everything else. Um, they collect either the script or the artwork or both
Yes.
in the back,
Yeah.
and you can kind of see some of the thought processes of each artist. And Mike's work is really just as you would expect. It's really blocky. It's really like white or black, black or white, and it's um, I don't know. He's got his own feel. He kind of like gives people expressions that are old fashioned, I think, feeling.
Yeah.
The monsters are sort of his own creation and they're all
Yeah.
wacky in themselves.
Exactly.
He even has like some of his artwork in the back and he like makes a little note like, I don't know who these people are, or like, I don't know where I was going with this, or,
Oh, for sure.
this is weird anatomy. And, he makes out like, I'm trying to figure out this demon devil thing. And um, I just, I even try to just look at some of his work and sort of emulate it. It's fun, it's quirky, but
Sure.
it's also like spooky a little bit,
Yeah. And then, just some of the people that helped him, at least in this edition and a couple other editions, like some of the big ones that he had is James St. Clair, Matthew Hollingsworth, and Dave Stewart. Those are all huge like colors in their own industry.
Yeah.
Like Matt Hollingsworth and Dave Stewart, they still do stuff today. And even like Dave Stewart's probably one of my favorite colorists that are out there. He has such an eye for the page, and he's always good about working with his penciler and the artists and the writers, and just trying to figure out like what are you trying to get across.
It was like,
And
hey, you want to help me out? They're like, sure.
yeah, because he's really good. So it's really cool to see that come to life, as we're going through this. But yeah, I guess Hellboy, he has been around for a good while, and it's really cool to see that see the tale evolve and just the progression. I think it was really cool to see him just even going beyond like the origin story of like, hey, he got summoned out of hell by the Nazis and things like that. And first he's like they're trying to make him out to be their like savior of like doing evil and stuff. He's like, I don't want to do that. He got saved. Then he got saved by this like band of hunters that have like been like lurking in the shadows of like
Hmm.
history and things. And just how that evolved and working at the Bureau for like paranormal investigation and stuff like that.
Yeah. So even in the first one or two volumes, so Hellboy was summoned by the Nazis in a ritual, and he appeared as
During World War II, as
yeah,
one does.
during World War II, and just in the waning days of like the Third Reich. So like
Yeah.
kind of when Germany was failing, they were like,
Uh,
"Gosh, we need something,
yeah.
right?" So Rasputin joined the Nazis and sort of summoned a little demon.
Yep.
And what happened was the Nazis were not able to capture him,
Yep.
the Americans did, and they raised him.
Yeah.
So he is raised sort of with
American
American
values.
values and ideals,
No.
right?
Hmm.
And even in the book, he makes comments here and there of like, I've been fighting the supernatural for 40 years. So, I mean,
Yeah.
he's been doing it for a while. Um, he's full grown now, and he has on his right hand uh, like a giant
Like
glove
stone, like glove,
gauntlet.
gauntlet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to describe it as
Yeah,
a
and it's
gauntlet.
like this huge. So when you see Hellboy, and that was one of the things I think people are like, "What the heck's wrong with his arm?" It's like,
Yeah.
well, something's on his arm.
Arm.
Like his hand
It's
is a
significant. Yeah.
stone hand,
Right.
and he never knew what it was, and no one knows what it is until later in the story. So
Yeah.
it was just sort of this like writing. I don't want to say trope, but like a writing thing that Mike could sort of reference every once in a while. Is like, I don't know what my right hand is, but then other people are like, well, I do. And then
Yeah.
Rasputin's like, well, I'll tell you what it is. I'll show
Exactly.
you
And
the
it gives them
power. And
so much room to work with.
yes, and it's so cool to just keep that as like I don't know, just a side story that you can
Yeah.
develop someday when you're ready. Um, so Hellboy, what I really like is that he So he works at the Paranormal Research.
Yeah, a Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense,
Yes.
BPRD. That's
And
where he starts
so
out.
he has like a trench coat that's
Sounds great.
full of like his trench coat is full of artifacts and like um, talismans and little coins and things and stuff that he can keep to ward off attacks from the supernatural. So it's just they've really thought about his character in general. So he's fearless, but he's also superstitious.
Yeah. And I think that that does really cool for like storytelling because then you can bring all that mythology, that dark mythology that you don't necessarily know about because who does a lot of that research? Mike
Yeah,
Mignola,
yeah,
the
he knows them
fanboy
all.
knows.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
knows
he
all.
knows them all, and you can tell how much research he put in and trying to take bits and pieces of mythology and kind of hybriding them a bit, or like, hey, this would sound better if I did this with it, and kind of does a really good job of interweaving this mythology with what he
What is
also
it? The
wants to
Baba
do.
Yaga.
The Baba Yaga. Oh my gosh. Yeah. When we get to Baba Yaga, that was one of my favorite villains. Like, yes, Rasputin. Rasputin's cool. He does his own thing. He's a little
Yeah,
bit,
but he's still like very human and
yup.
like
And he has the
Nazi-ish, I guess.
Nazis trope, that's great. But Baba Yaga is like her own larger than life. Like, if you cross me, you're gonna get it. And she is a great reoccurring villain
It's
in the
like her
series.
house with the chicken legs is like
Yes. And I
so
love that tale and things like that because she's very like, oh, I'll grant you this wish and everything, but you gotta give me something in return. And
yes.
her house travels wrong, and she's kind of creepy in her own right. And she's just such an interesting villain that it kind of really does a well job of just grounding that character and but also like you could do anything and all these zany things that you're like, okay. Um, definitely appreciated that. Yeah. And then when you get to like Hecate and things like that, all the
Yes.
gods and
I was just
um
gonna say, and Hecate is very
she's like a Greek
popular
god.
in like
Yeah.
Sabrina the Teenage Witch
Oh, okay.
show,
I
and
know
she
that.
was in like Charmed, and she was in um a lot of people use that
Yeah.
connection point. That character is um
Yeah. She's the goddess of magic, witchcraft, the night moon, and ghosts and
yeah,
necromancy.
so very paganish and very
Yeah.
and then he jumps right over and he starts connecting with like the witches of Roman times, and then he jumps
Yeah.
back over to the Nazis, and then he jumps back over. It's really really cool that those side stories are worthy of your time to even look up and familiarize yourself with those fables. That's what I like. It was like
Yes.
now I want to say grounded in history, but it was like, yeah, this is something that he's pulled inspiration from, and that's
Yep.
awesome.
Yeah, and you really get to develop like who your favorite characters are and how they're connected to each other because they're always kind of like piggybacking off each other a bit or trying to join forces or going to war against each other and trying to fight over Hellboy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this power and significance that he brings about this like prophecy of war, and he's gonna be like the king of hell and things like that.
So for volumes 1, 2, and 3, there's 6 volumes of the library edition. So like volumes
Yes.
1, 2, and 3, and maybe 4 are just sort of Hellboy responding to different kind of supernatural activities. So it's almost uh, um,
Like a
like an
monster of
X
the week.
Files kind of
Yeah,
thing,
monster of the week, X
Yeah.
Files feel. Yeah,
Yeah. So
absolutely.
like something came up and it's in Austria, and I'm like, all right, well, we're taking the team out to Austria. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, they go all over the world. They
yeah.
don't just stay in like America and New York and things like that.
In fact, I think they're probably in Europe more than anywhere
Yeah,
else.
London is a little bit of their headquarters, I would say. Yeah.
So it's Hellboy, and then there's Liz, right?
Yep, when they
Uh,
start out and
and then
Abe
Abe
Sapien.
Sapien.
Yeah, Abe Sapien so cool.
Yeah, he was pulled from some other experiment, and they noticed on his nameplate that it said Sapien, but then they named him after Abraham Lincoln, so he said
Right. Yeah, so you're
Abe
like,
Sapien.
okay, okay.
It's just
Yeah.
cool characters, and then they have like 3 or 4 other people usually with them, but then they kind of do that like Star Trek trope where like, oh, there's a new guy, he's probably gonna get killed or something.
Yeah, right.
It's just like always happens.
Hmm. I would say so, and they also kind of brought this great opportunity in the Mignola universe, they call it now, where they'll probably take Hellboy was kind of going off, I think, for 2 volumes worth. And then they said, okay, Hellboy's going to go on his own adventures. He's going to kind of start
Yeah.
soloing it a bit. So we're going to take that team aspect that you guys liked in the beginning. We're going to do its own thing with BPRD. And then Abe Sapien's going to have his own solo series. We're going to really invest in all these side characters that maybe you never thought would be really cool, but he kind of shared it with other writers and things that he trusted with his property, that he's like, hey, go out and write stories.
Yeah, and that's the other. I think I don't want to say generous, but the really nice thing about it is that Mike Mignola realized that these were characters that he couldn't by himself
Yeah.
fully flesh out and do them justice. So he was like, I will do some of the basic, like maybe cover
Yeah.
art and
Cover
sort of
art. Yeah.
layouts and things,
Yep.
but he let everyone else sort of jump into it because it just became sort of a
Bigger than
phenomenon.
what I think he
Yeah.
expected to be.
Right. And
Absolutely.
people are like, gosh, you got 5 or 6 main characters here instead of
Yeah.
just Hellboy. Like some of these are overshadowing Hellboy
Yeah.
because he just wrote them really fun and people want to see more of that.
And their hardcovers are like the most beautiful thing ever to see on the
Yes.
shelf together.
Yes.
Because
So
you got probably like 20, 30 years. It gets
what is it?
really
Plague of Frogs and Lobster Johnson.
Baltimore,
Oh, Baltimore.
Joe the Golem and things like that. And Lobster Johnson's like one of the big pulp pharaohs and stuff like that.
And then Hellboy kind of was freed up to follow his own
Yeah,
destiny, which
right.
they always pushed was like,
Yeah.
you have a bigger story here. And the overall gist of it is that Hellboy is from hell, and
Yeah.
he's a part of that sort of
Demon.
domain
Yeah. Demonscape, hell.
and he was either poised to be like the prince of hell, or he
Yep.
was poised to eventually take over hell.
Right. And
And
that's something
yeah, he doesn't.
it's one of those like nature nurture arguments
Mhm.
where since he was raised by the Americans versus maybe not so
Influenced
nice
by the Nazis,
the Nazis
right?
and evil powers, he has this own like free will about him and free to choose his destiny, and I think it was encouraged. Obviously people are like, oh, you gotta do the ultimate good or save the day. He's encouraged to do that, but he's gonna do it in his own way. He's not
Yeah.
nobody's forcing him to do anything.
And he always sort of rejected it because he does have some good in him, but at the same time, I think he also wants to say like, well, the true villain part is like, if I could take this over, maybe I could turn it around.
Yeah.
If I sacrificed myself, maybe I alone would have the power to not go through this prophecy.
Yeah.
So there's that
And
duality
break
too.
that chain. Yeah. Absolutely. So I guess now that we've kind of given this basic overview and things like that, Ramos, what are some of your favorite stories from the initial Hellboy run?
So there are some straight up real fun stories that are standalone, or to me, the corpse is one of the really really good
Yes.
ones. Not only because, and I always look at like, what is the point of the story, and then how is it, you know, I think drawn or told, right?
Right.
I think a lot of people think The Crooked Man is probably one of the best
Yes, I would say
ones.
the Crooked Man is one of my
It's always in
favorites.
like the top 3 or
Yeah,
top 5. People
I would
love
say
that.
the Crooked Man and the Conqueror Worm were probably like A+ for my book. Like I
The
just gravitated
the
towards them.
Crooked Man is in volume 4, and then The Corpse is in volume 2.
Yes, and
Uh,
you kind of, as you keep reading, you realize how important the corpse was, that story.
yes.
And I'm like, everything that I kept reading after that was like, oh, reference in the corpse, reference in the corpse.
Yeah.
And I like that Mike kept those like notes for the reader and the audience to keep track of, because that was like an old Marvel, and probably, I don't know, maybe DC did some of that, where, hey, go, editor's note, go look up X issue
Yeah.
and go read that, because this is a really important character and really important story.
Yeah, and I'm kind of flipping through The Corpse right now. it's just a fun story because it showed sort of another power that Hellboy had, and it was that he can connect with the underworld, or he can
Yes, to
connect with,
speak to the dead. Yeah.
yeah, speak to the dead. So you do kind of see some other powers pop up here and there, and even though Hellboy is from hell, he respects that everyone has their own like vices. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he respects that there are people who are not very good, and he
Yeah.
feels that people are like lost or failed or in vertigo, or in purgatory. There's a lot that Hellboy, I think, works out. And to me, it just really showed like the quick-witted writing that
Yes.
can
Oh yeah,
happen,
totally.
because his
Yeah.
corpse is like, he cuts down a corpse and sort of carries it on his back, and he keeps talking to it, and they kind of banter back and forth.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you're kind of put through this scenario where like Hellboy has an overall mission, but he also doesn't turn a blind eye on other things in need, which I think is a great part of Hellboy.
Sure.
Um, Also, if you look at the Hellboy drawings, you'll notice like two big circles on his head. That's because
Yep.
they're supposed to be horns,
Horns.
and he
Yeah.
cuts them off to like, and then
Establish
they
that.
grow back, and he cuts
Yeah.
them off, and they grow back, and they cut,
Mm-hmm.
and he sort of rejects that. So to him,
Rejects the monster.
yeah, he
Yeah.
doesn't want to be like a horned demon. He already feels like, well, I'm already red.
Yeah.
Um, and you'll notice too that his hair is tied back into like a knot, and he follows sort of like a samurai way.
Oh yeah. I guess
That's
those some of those
Yeah,
qualities.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's kind
Personality
of what it
traits.
is, like a lone, like a Ronin kind of thing.
Sure.
So that's where he has that part of it where he pulls his hair back because he feels like he has honor, and he wants to keep himself in that aspect.
Sure. And just kind of go over and over a few pages from like the corpse. It's very, the monster's going after him. He's like, oh, he's beating him up. He's like, yes, that's working. I love when things work. That's all for you, war monster. Get lost. I had more time. Help. Now what's your problem? Come on, you. Almost there. We gotta go. I lost my arm, and that's like the corpse, like, "Ah, I lost my arm."
Yeah.
So it's this very witty banter that Hellboy is like establishing, and he doesn't really take his job too seriously. But at the same time, he knows, yeah, he's the only one to do it.
Yeah, and a lot of times it is just sort of like him talking in little bursts. It's
Yeah,
not like some,
long dialogue.
yeah, some
Yeah,
big,
grandiose
soliloquy that
thing.
he's like putting
Yeah,
together, and like there, it's not always some sort of um quotable references of anything. It's just him being like, "Oh, nuts," or, "Oh, I didn't expect this," and then there's like a big explosion, or
no,
something.
yeah, you're
He's
like,
just like, "Well, that doesn't really work out."
right.
You
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And yeah, and then it just kind of, you see the story evolving and the art evolving. It's really something to behold. And when we get along to like my favorite story, like the Conqueror, like he's interacting with like space aliens that
Yes.
really come down, but like the Nazis kind of called them down. You're like, what's this?
And that's usually one of the stories, is that there is some sort of portal that's opening, or there's some sort of ancient evil
Evil
that was
that's awakening.
yeah.
Yeah,
And so
because of
Hellboy's
the
like,
events that
I gotta
happen.
stop this. So he's been saving the world sort of secretly, and you never really get into the whole like people see him and they think, oh God, there's a monster. I mean,
No,
uh,
right.
they kind of steered away
I
from
think
that.
that's more of something that in the movies, like they were trying to put people
Yes.
against him. I don't know if that was something that in the comics that he was trying to get that over. Maybe in the first like volume or something, like, oh, you're weird. You're weird looking. Yeah.
Maybe, but he's always surrounded by people who
Like-minded
are
individuals and
already,
things on
you
his
know,
side, or like, hey, we
yeah.
gotta do that. I like when he does interact with the dead and stuff, and he's got this great respect for it. And later on, some of the storylines, like he doesn't realize he's talking to the dead. He thinks they're alive. He's having
Yes.
like carrying on like whole like 10-page story of like him, just, or a 5-page story, like talking to him like he used to, and things like that. And he's like, oh, they're not around anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, and that's like the dead communicating into him like through memories. And prophecies and weird magic and stuff. So that was really interesting.
I really like too, and I finally flipped to it. I was looking for it, but I finally found it. But I really like when they kind of collect the fables and the other stories. They
Yes.
all like know each other,
Yeah,
so they're
we
like,
were talking about
oh,
that. Yeah.
there's like
This is like
four
the
or
Fairy
five side
King.
stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's not just one villain, but they all sort of respect each other.
Yes.
So they're all like, oh, this is your domain, or oh,
Hmm.
why don't you go back to the other netherworld? And
Exactly.
everyone has their own little piece, and for some reason they all, well, not for some reason, but they all genuinely like fear Hellboy's potential. They're always
Yes.
talking about
They're
that,
all
like,
like, "Don't do that,"
yeah, like,
You,
what if he evolves, what if he
what if
takes
he
over?
does something wrong or
Yeah.
sets off the ultimate evil? Sometimes he sets off the evil, and not by accident. But,
And it was like a part of it, but at the same time they almost want to like stop him, but they can't stop him because he's pretty strong.
yeah.
And so he just, everyone else, I feel like, I guess a good way to sum it up is they all are governed by rules of their own fable,
Yes.
and they are scared of doing certain things out of character, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
that's a good
like,
way to put it.
and sort of losing their own magic or overlapping each other,
Yeah.
where Hellboy just doesn't care.
No.
He just like, he just barrels
has
through.
to stop the bad guy, and
Yeah.
all. He's pretty knowledgeable about most fables because that's what his father and like the beginning story was kind of taught him and raised him on. And he's like had a good education.
Yeah,
And
like
things
he's
like that.
superstitious
Yeah.
too. He's like, oh
Know the
great, this is
fables,
her
so
again.
so yeah. So Hellboy. It was a great adventure to go on, and we definitely encourage readers and you all to do that, and explore it, in however whatever format you can. It was cool when you know Mike Mignola finally started letting the reins kind of go and exploring different artists like Richard Corbin. Richard Corbin is no, I think he was one of the early artists that recently passed away um, in 2020, but definitely would look up his art and some of like, what was it, Craig Russell and things like that. He had great respect for him and to help like carry out the story and
I mean, it
fully
probably can't
realize the
be.
vision.
Yeah, it can't be understated that, you take a character that you made from that's your character, and you feel comfortable enough to pass them over to
Yeah.
another artist. That's a big leap,
Yes,
especially how grounded he
exactly.
got
And
them. Yeah.
when the movies were starting to finally get developed, and it was actually going to be a real serious like effort and commitment, like Mike was starting to get buried into his work and stuff, so he had to kind of his editor helped him like, hey, let's bring in some of these artists, let's see what they look like, what they can do, and he finally started like, oh, okay, this is actually really good. Okay,
Mhm.
I trust this team, and I trust what they can do, and
He wanted to keep the story
you want to
going, not
keep the
just
story
pause it.
moving, right? Because sometimes, when you're doing a lot of these short stories, it's hard to get back to the main story.
Right.
Even though there's all these little interconnections, things like that, you're like, someday I just want to finish this, see an end to it. So it was really cool to see how he went from, the start and Waking the Devil and Seed of Destruction to just where he is and where he goes. So, yeah, great evolution. I think Hellboy will be his legacy, but it's such a growing, like, I don't know, universe. The Magnolia
Yeah.
universe, as they call it. Like, it'll just keep going. And I think Mike, he kickstarted like a documentary about, his work on Hellboy and where kind of the fandom went and capturing it.
Well, like some other comic books too, you can pick up one and be like, "Oh, that is so 60s," or "Oh, that language isn't around anymore," or no one talks like that, or you can pick up
Yeah.
a 90s comic and be like, "This is
Just
really
so
90s
90s.
Marvel," like,
Yeah.
gosh, everyone's got like long hair.
And shoulder
But
pads.
yeah, and you could pull a Mike Mignola story about Hellboy from the late 90s, and no
Yes.
joke, it has aged perfectly. It's
Yeah.
amazing still, an amazing story. I love the Hellboy
Yeah,
series. I
and
love Mike
it's a
Mignola's.
great story for a spooky read or a great just adventure story that you can sink your teeth into. Um, Definitely, we recommend it in whatever format you can get. Thank you for checking us out on Bam Pow Comic Con. This is Andrew Honor
And Chris Ramos,
signing off.
goodbye.